Good morning. How's everyone doing? Good. Glad to have you here on this. It's a spring day, I guess. So today's topic, I was really excited for this topic just because it's so very personal to the Twin Cities, as some of you may know. This sort of post-war era of clearance and demolition and urban renewal and freeway building is has impacted our communities here in the Twin Cities and across Minnesota a lot. And there are things that happened during that period that were great, and there are things that we're still trying to repair some of the damage that had been done. And this summer, I've been working on writing walking tours we're doing of downtown St. Paul. And so much of the downtown core of St. Paul is this history of this sort of post-war era of clearance and rebuilding and city planning, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully. And so do you need to hear a perspective on that period is going to be really exciting for us. So I want to introduce our speaker, Dr. Francesca Ammon. She is an associate professor of city and regional planning and historic preservation at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. She is the author of the award-winning book, Bulldozer, Demolition and Clearance of the Post-War Landscape. She works on a lot of different things around urban planning, the built environment, and the social, material, and cultural life of American cities, particularly from World War II to the present. Some of the recent work she's been doing has been a project called Preserving Society Hill, which is all about documenting the history of a neighborhood in Philadelphia that was severely impacted, both by urban renewal and clearance, but also by historic preservation and trying to map that history. And yeah, she's got degrees in both civil engineering, environmental design, American studies. So she's bringing a real multidisciplinary approach to this topic, which is really exciting for us. Again, we're always trying to find new ways to think about history and to broaden our understandings of the past. So this is very exciting for us. So please join me in giving a Minnesota welcome to Dr. Francesca Ammon.
Great, thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. It's really wonderful to be here. I appreciate the invitation. I especially want to thank Jacob for inviting me and for all the logistics of getting me here. Thanks also to Mike, who's handling the AV, and thank you all for coming out here in person and on Zoom. I'm delighted to be speaking as part of the History Forum series, and I'm going to draw upon my book, as Jacob mentioned, Bulldozer, which is really kind of the first scholarly history of the bulldozer. There's a lot of work about this topic, there are books written by enthusiasts who can tell you more about some of the mechanical details of all these things. And when I first started looking up this topic, I knew I wanted to write about demolition. I felt it was something that was really important to the shape of the built environment, but that it's a phase that often was skipped over. We often, look at the before and after. And I looked in the card catalog, and children's books came up a lot too. So there are a lot of children's books about bulldozers. I'll talk about that as well. But mine is more scholarly take that excavates both the means and the meanings of demolition and clearance in the post-war American landscape. And I really ask how it is that post-war Americans came to equate destruction with progress, right? Why did this often violent erasing process, why was this seen as modern and moving forward for cities, for suburbs, for rural areas as well? So I'm going to offer a brief overview of the project's three main parts, and then I'll dig more deeply into one of the book's main storylines to demonstrate the intertwined influence of the military and the bulldozer businesses of various types in the making of the post-war landscape. So let me begin. The shape of the American landscape changed dramatically in the decades following World War II. In order to clear space for new suburban tract housing, interstate highways, and urban renewal development, wrecking companies demolished buildings, and earth-moving contractors leveled land at an unprecedented pace and scale. This isn't to say that these things didn't happen before that, but they happened at a higher rate and across the country at this period in time. Of course, they continue to happen today, but this was like the peak moment. And I've calculated, for example, that during the 1960s, which is really the epitome, demolition crews tore down 1 out of every 17 dwelling units nationwide. That was on average across the country. Most of these losses came from urban renewal, which displaced 1 million families nationwide and over 100,000 businesses by 1980 when the program came to a close. At the same time, each of the more than 46,000 miles of interstate highways, on average, consume the homes of approximately 20 individuals and roughly 40 acres of land. So in total, interstate highways construction removed a total of 42 billion cubic yards of earth. That's a lot of earth moved. Clearance for the development of suburban housing, industry, shopping, added further acreage to the toll. So I think the post-war decades are well known as an era of rapid growth and construction. I want to kind of turn that tale a little bit and emphasize that they were equally significant for the celebration and implementation of large-scale destruction. And it was that destruction that made a lot of that construction possible. Now, the post-war period is exceptional within, as I said, a long history of the creative destruction of the American landscape for the realization of large-scale clearance on a nationwide level, not just a couple cities doing it, but across the country. And I'm arguing in the book that something that I call a culture of clearance, the ideology, technology, policy, and practice of large-scale destruction made possible this vast remaking of city and country. I also argue that this culture of clearance was powerfully rooted in the preceding experience of war. And here you can see International Harvester, bulldozers, and other construction equipment lined up to be shipped out on the Pacific front. Now, although the proliferation of the bulldozer in scholarly texts beginning in at least the early 1960s might suggest that this literary terrain is well covered, and here are a couple of books that talk about this subject, the term is often served more as a symbol of protest than a subject of inquiry. Authors of works like these shown here name the machine as the enemy of minority urban residents, of elite preservationists, and of suburban environmentalists. They haven't typically investigated how it worked or why it initially appealed to so many people, from mayors to developers, engineers, and even the general public. Through a variety of sources ranging from military logbooks to the archives of construction equipment manufacturers, popular and trade journals, redevelopment agency records, the census, oral histories, popular movies, and children's books, I place the machine itself front and center, kind of like the way it is in this picture. And then I trace the unraveling of the bulldozer's broad base of support as its destructive process played out on the ground. In this way, I'm sort of exploring a subject that's remained hidden in plain sight. Think, for example, of the before and after images that dominate the visual iconography of the post-war built environment. Here's just one kind of typical pairing from Progressive Architecture magazine in 1968. It shows aerial views of the Oak Street neighborhood in New Haven, Connecticut, before and after urban renewal. And these kind of, I'm sure you've seen images like this for your own city too. On the left is a dense mixed-use area of predominantly 3 to 5 story wood and brick structures containing housing, religious institutions, shops, light industry. And on the right are the high rises, the office buildings, parking lots, and a highway. These are typical forms that we're remaking cities across the country. There are also ground level versions of this showing dilapidated kitchens, for example, then modern updated kitchens and new appliances on the right. So when I say that clearance falls between the cracks of existing discourse, I mean this quite literally, because I'm interested in what went on in the gap between these stereotypical before and after scenes. What happened in the gap between these two pictures, which are often the scenes that we don't see, that we don't talk about, and we don't understand how we got from one to the other. I'm wondering really, what did so-called progress look like when it was in progress on the ground? And that's what I want to share with you this morning. So in examining the process behind the creation of the built environment, I'm suggesting then that it's not only what we build, but how we build that matters. And so what does an examination of landscape creation through destruction tell us? Well, I narrate that story in 3 parts: bulldozers at war, bulldozers at work, and bulldozers of the mind. And I'll very briefly outline each of these to you before digging in more deeply. So in the first part of the book, Bulldozers at War, I trace the technological, economic, and cultural foundations of modern mass clearance to mid-century theaters of war. I really think that World War II was critical for launching us into this new period that followed. In this way, I'm reperiodizing post-war American urban history and placing it in a more global context. A lot of urban history courses, and I teach them, kind of skip over the war as an interruption, and rightly so to some degree. You know, a lot of housing construction stopped, a lot of highway construction, those things stopped so that resources could be redeployed towards the war. But actually, that lack of investment built up an appetite for new construction afterwards, and I'll say more about that. War laid important groundwork for the domestic built environment that followed that's often overlooked when we begin the study of post-war cities and suburbs only after the war ended. Rather than serving as a mere interruption to housing and highway work, World War II was a critical catalyst to the shape of the post-war American landscape. Viewing it this way demonstrates how wartime innovations and exceptional practices, or things that we think are exceptions for war, can spill over into post-war domestic life and become normalized. World War II advanced potent technologies, including the atomic bomb, air power, and chemical weapons, and the bulldozer and construction equipment more broadly stand beside these. Such wartime to peacetime technological transfer is as relevant to World War II and its aftermath as it is to more contemporary conflicts. In the case of bulldozers, as with things like today's military drones, for example, individual machines don't typically move from one environment to the other, but the technology it does, and other examples of those machines do move. The technology, the ideology, and the practice of deploying those machines. So to take this a step further, the flow of construction-related machines, men, methods, and metaphors from international battlefronts to the domestic home front facilitated what we might think of to some degree as a militarization of the post-war American landscape. And I'll say more about this. In part 2, Bulldozers at Work, I examined the often separately treated histories of post-war cities, suburbs, and rural landscapes, showing how similar material and cultural processes shaped them all, right? Cities and suburbs wound up looking quite different at the end of the war, but what was undergirding the changes that occurred there were quite similar. Using case studies of land clearance in Orange County, California, building demolition in New Haven, Connecticut, and the combination of both practices for highway construction all across the country, I show how diverse geographies shared a common quest for the seemingly, quote unquote, blank slates that were necessary for new large-scale development. Business proved critical in realizing these ideals. In their pursuit of post-war profits, equipment manufacturers and operators helped add buildings and land to the list of goods devoured by post-war mass consumption. Further, these parallel pursuits yielded related consequences. In each, celebratory tropes of rapid progress gave way on the ground to damaging processes of spatial destruction and environmental injustice. And these costs, of course, were disproportionately distributed along lines of race, class, sex, and gender. And in the final section of the project, Bulldozers of the Mind, I show that just as bulldozers transformed the physical landscape, they also permeated cultural imagination. This slide shows 2 examples of this, a children's book on the left and a still from a film of the house wrecking made by the artist Gordon Matta Clark on the right, so kind of low and high forms of cultural art. Diverse popular representations in films, photographs, conceptual art, and children's books and toys both reflected and shaped clearance practices. They provided windows into how the public saw this work, and over time, these forms also helped voice more critical turns in popular attitudes as a culture of clearance gave way, at least somewhat, to a culture of conservation. These forms also illustrate the significance not only of representations like plans and architectural drawings and photographs that we often consider when thinking about the built environment, but also a broader cultural discourse, books, artwork, etc., to the shape of the built world. So now I'd like to elaborate on an integral piece of my argument that cuts across all 3 of these sections of the project, the ways that what we might call the bulldozer businesses, that is equipment manufacturers, engineers, and construction men, built upon the war to make the post-war American landscape physically, economically, and psychologically possible. we can see these connections along at least 4 key dimensions. This is my only text slide, but I just want to highlight what my structure is from here on out. And I'll use this to structure the remainder of the talk. There are 4 key ways in which these businesses contributed to the reshaping of the American landscape. 1, through advances in equipment technology. 2, through training of equipment operators. 3, through the rehearsal of the applications of large-scale building demolition and earth-moving practices. And 4, through the glorification of the bulldozer, its operators, and its practices in a positive all-American light. All these factors, as I've already noted, were powerfully rooted in the preceding experience of war, and that's where I'll begin. All right, so during World War II, thousands of US manufacturers reoriented their factories for wartime production, right? They had to stop making what they had been making before the war and support the war effort. They made tanks, airplanes, shells, and other armaments. You might think, for example, right, of Ford assembly lines churning out aircraft at Willow Run. But for many construction equipment manufacturers, wartime production demands were largely compatible with what they had been making before the war. Allied forces, for example, deployed more than 100,000 tractors during World War II. They equipped many of these tractors with bulldozer blades, turning them into the machine that we commonly refer to as the bulldozer, even though technically bulldozer refers to the blade alone, but that's not how people talk about these things. So I'll refer to the whole machine. And also, a lot of people call things bulldozers that aren't technically bulldozers. So I'm lumping all these things together because conceptually they're understood in similar ways. Now, as you see in this ad, this large-scale construction equipment deployment even led one manufacturer, International Harvester, to call the entire conflict a dirt-moving war. During World War II, the tractor bulldozer proved so important to the military that the War Production Board ultimately asked Caterpillar, which was the #1 construction equipment supplier of the military, to stop work on diesel tank engines, right? They had shifted to making tank engines and instead devote more resources to crawler tractor production. Caterpillar self-servingly suggested that this signaled the machine was more important than the tank. General Patton made the comparison explicit when he purportedly, quote, stated that if he had to choose between bulldozers and tanks for an invasion, he would choose the bulldozers every time. Now, although I focus here on the bulldozer, as I said, the military commanded an array of construction equipment on the battlefield, including cranes, shovels, and scrapers. Scrapers are these vehicles that kind of transport the dirt. They're big bowls on tractor, on tracks on the ground to move. And what's important to note here is that in producing these machines, equipment manufacturers simultaneously advanced their commercial product lines, right? So they'd be well equipped to offer these products after the war was through. But Patton wasn't the only one singing the praises of the bulldozer. One of the most famous urban renewal developers, William Zeckendorf, once called the bulldozer, quote, the best invention we got out of the war. In truth, the war didn't spur the invention of any new major pieces of construction equipment. What it did was improve those products that already existed. It hastened the advancement of core existing technologies, the bulldozer among them. Ads like this one from International Harvester tout these advances. It declares that when Harvester machines went to war, nothing changed but the paint. They were ready to go. They were already suited to battlefield conflicts. Over time, however, in the machines they were producing by the heart of the conflict, everything, that is the technology at the heart of the machines, had changed but the paint. In the pre-war years, there was little consumer demand for improvement of slow operating, medium-sized tractors that relied upon favorable weather and conditions of the terrain for their operation. But World War II was, quote, the crucible, as one equipment expert put it, that stimulated the intensity of research activity necessary for improved machines. So the pace of progress had been gradual but slow, and the war upped those efforts. As the war came to a close, manufacturers could advertise to their customers who had been deprived of purchasing new construction equipment at home during the war that they'd soon be able to buy products that had been proven on tough battlefield terrain. Thus, for companies like Caterpillar, which was one of the top 100 out of more than 85,000 war contractors, the war was not a distraction from business as usual, but rather an intensification of everyday life that positioned them well to the return to peacetime operations. So post-war construction equipment advanced accordingly. On pre-war machines, cable-based operations had dominated, but during the war and post-war years, hydraulic controls became increasingly common. They provided faster responses, smoother cycling, new metallurgy made the machines more durable and stronger. Engines increased in power and speed, shovels grew in capacity. It was just a step change in what these machines could do. As Popular Science noted just 5 years after the war's end, the new, quote, big mouth machines could eat a ton of earth per second and, quote, literally move a mountain a day. Now, the concurrent development of smaller but powerful machines offered mechanization in confined and isolated spaces, and all these wartime advances continued over time, such that between 1950 and 1960, that first full decade after the war, the Caterpillar tractor-scraper combination increased its capacity by 30% and its horsepower by 50%, just continuing that pace of rapid improvement. These gains more than balanced out associated growth in equipment price. So by the 1960s, earth-moving costs were still as low as they had been in 1929. So bulldozing was cheap, and that's key. Now, in addition to advancing equipment, we're also trained an army of men to maintain and operate these machines, and they were largely men. Caterpillar and International Harvester staffed their own battalions to service these machines in the field, keeping both the equipment and the men's own skills in fighting shape. Other soldiers also took up the construction trades for military purposes during the war. They served as Army engineers, a division that had already existed before the war, and as part of the construction battalions, or Seabees for short. And the Seabees were a new division of the Navy formed during World War II to both build and fight. Originally, the Seabees tapped men who were often a bit older in age, who had the skills, construction skills that were necessary, so they could put those skills immediately to use. Over time, though, that arsenal of skill was tapped out, and they needed to train new, younger men. So people gained new skills by joining the CB ranks. In total, more than 325,000 men served in the Seabees during World War II, which is roughly equivalent to the size of the entire present-day Navy. When these men came home, they brought their new and refined skills with them. Take, for example, a Seabee named Oscar Williams, who joined the 133rd Battalion right out of high school and learned to be a construction equipment operator there. He later sat down for an oral history interview with the Smithsonian, and he talked about his return back home to Michigan. I went back to being an operator, he said. I've got 43 years in as a union operator, 2.5 in the Navy, and I don't regret a day of it. And Williams was one of many relatively unknown construction men who helped remake the wartime and post-war landscape. A more famous figure, perhaps, is Bill Levitt, who recalled nights spent talking with his fellow Seabees on the battlefront about how to complete the vast projects going on around them faster and better. This wartime experience, he later concluded, offered an unparalleled laboratory for experimentation and analysis with construction industry peers, right? He had his colleagues around him to test out this equipment, to bat around ideas, and advance their thinking. After the conflict ended, Levitt famously put his experience to use, clearing over 1,000 acres of potato fields for the construction of Levittown, Long Island, and other Levitt towns around the country. A firm run by another Seabee, former Seabee, performed clearance work for nearly every interstate in Southern California. While still other Army engineers founded a wrecking and construction company that completed urban renewal building demolition in New Haven, Connecticut. Kind of everywhere I looked, I found in the histories of a lot of the individuals working on these post-war projects, a connection to the wartime military and its own construction work. And there are many other such stories of soldiers for whom wartime equipment experience translated into post-war employment back home. Now, the rise of post-war equipment operator schools helped to supplement the ranks of these returning veterans. One such facility was the National School of Heavy Earth-Moving Operation, established in 1955 in North Carolina. On the school's 71 acres of hilly soil, classes of 30 students each spent 4 to 8 weeks in a boot camp environment learning the art of cut and fill. Most classes at Bulldozer U, as one journalist dubbed it, filled to capacity, sometimes months in advance. And over time, similar programs emerged around the country, such as the Greer Earth Moving School, which is the one that's pictured here in this photograph from Life magazine. So war set in motion a mobilization of heavy equipment operator training that only continued after the foreign conflict was through. Of course, racial minorities, to say nothing of women, rarely partook of the employment opportunities offered by post-war construction work. This was a continuation of wartime labor practices in the military. For example, African Americans serving in the Army engineers during World War II typically performed manual work with picks and shovels, while white men were more often trained in heavy equipment operation. After the war, contractors and trade unions continued to segregate skilled positions, and minorities received a disproportionately low share of ensuing construction employment. And the positions they did obtain were typically among the lower paying, non-unionized manual labor jobs, such as those depicted in the image on the left here. It wasn't until Richard Nixon's 1969 Philadelphia Plan for Affirmative Action that these practices really began to change. So there were beneficiaries of this wartime training, but those opportunities were distributed unevenly. Indeed, by 1973, when an earth-moving training program started in Alabama, targeting rural Blacks in particular, the program was unusual enough to merit a whole article in Ebony magazine. Now, war not only advanced equipment and trained laborers, but it also effectively rehearsed and normalized practices of material and social clearance. As Seabees and engineers implemented clearance upon foreign terrain, they turned battlefields into proving grounds for home front construction sites. On the Atlantic, for example, they cleared rubble-strewn cities and crushed any built impediments to forward advancement. And depictions of this work often equated it with the removal of demolition and rubble as with cleaning and rebirth, right? Putting a forward-looking positive spin on what was going on here, the beginning of something new. Planners and architects identified in this destruction opportunities for bigger and better new plans back home in order to build order out of chaos as they were viewing cities in the post-war United States. And we can see these activities and outlooks mirrored on the post-war American landscape as clearance for urban renewal and highways proactively cut out the purportedly diseased cores of American cities to remake them anew. One observer even described the urban renewal process as, quote, armies of bulldozers smashing down acres of slums. Right? Think of that kind of mobilization that was necessary to tackle this new enemy and problem. The impact on those cities, of course, was devastating. Now, this short clip that I'm going to show is excerpted from a Chamber of Commerce video created in 1956. It'll give you a sense for the ethos of the era and how cities were talking about the need to tear down in order to build up.
The contrast of 1880 and the present is becoming a common sight. The problems of our cities are real, however, because of the heavy hand of old-fashioned design. It affects residential property. Much of our industrial space presents a special problem with old multi-story buildings. The elaborate pigeon roost we see here suggests that obsolescence stalks our apartment properties. Substantial and ornate buildings are to be found everywhere. Surely obsolescence should not cause despair. It is one of the results of America's rapid growth. It is the basic challenge to cities, however, and a twofold problem: architectural obsolescence and narrow lot pattern. The truly dynamic American cities are those that are coming to grips with the problem of outmoded structures. Increasingly, we are seeing large-scale demolition as the first step in building modern cities. The need of the hour is to acquire plottage by merging narrow lots for a new start. Getting needed space in our cities for modern structures is the only way to meet the competitive force of growing suburban strength. Some of our demolition is an easy process because of much light wood construction. Often, the substance of our urban structures is such as to resist the power of the demolition hammer. As a people, however, we are steadfast as we tackle problems, and the hammer of demolition will be sure to swing with determination. In this jet age, events move fast, faster indeed than we sometimes realize, and our progress is certain to be steady as we clear away the structures that block progress.
All right, So you know I'm struck by how many times they struck that building, right? With the wrecking ball there. But I think it helps to convey kind of directly some of the arguments about why this removal of those obsolete buildings, why that is what's necessary to move forward for cities, and how demolition plays a key role in that. So in places like New Haven, Connecticut during the 1960s, which secured more federal urban renewal dollars per capita than any other city, which is in part why I'm focusing on it, 1 out of every 6 dwelling units fell. So I give you that statistic early on. National average, 1 out of every 17 fell across the country, 1 out of every 6 in New Haven. The case of New Haven strikingly reveals post-war depictions of urban renewal clearance as modern and synonymous with cleaning. The other reason to select New Haven is because of its mayor, Dick Lee, who I think more than many other mayors really embraced demolition as a strategy that he wanted to endorse and make visible. Lee was eager to showcase demolition, so eager that he was accused of purposefully leaving vacant buildings standing but untouched so that he would have sites readily available for demolition performances when a visiting notable or journalist came through town. In early 1958, he welcomed a Life magazine crew. And the article that they published about him dubbed him City Cleanup Champion. This image from their published piece clearly indicates Lee's joyful participation in and hands-on endorsement of this work. Another image shows his celebration of the snow-covered blank slate that resulted once clearance on one particular parcel was through. And note here how Lee, if he's blocking anything, he's blocking the new building that's going up. He wants you to see clearance as progress in and of itself. And this is land being cleared for a highway that sat for decades without being finished, but he wanted to celebrate the clearance. Oh, sorry, go back. Of course, the work of urban renewal building demolition was nowhere near as simple as such popularly circulated photographs suggested. And I'll use some other images from New Haven and elsewhere to make these points. Demolition produced massive amounts of rubble, which was difficult and costly to dispose of. Some developers unscrupulously buried materials on site and they could find no repositories willing to accept the materials. And their actions were only discovered when organic materials started to settle and the sites themselves that were built up settled to see what they had done, to reveal the truth of how they had disposed of this material. Other pieces of debris littered cleared lots for years, as it often took much longer to rebuild than it did to tear down, thereby imposing a different kind of blight on renewal neighborhoods. And although whole blocks were often intended to come down en masse, difficult relocations and legal opposition led structures to often come down in a much more patchwork pattern, as shown in this photo. So this entire block here is going to be cleared, but it took about 10 years actually for all the structures to come down. And the course of that meant that where big machines were once going to be utilized, companies had to switch to smaller ones to kind of get in between the structures. This was less efficient, it wound up being more costly. A lot of demolition companies actually went out of business. They went bankrupt in the course of doing this. And it raised the prices ultimately for cities that had to hire new contractors to complete the next work. Further, those who had to live alongside demolished structures, the pounding of wrecking balls damaged chimneys and party walls and conscribed neighboring citizens to live in, quote, the fear and dust of demolition, as one complainant put it. And this is to say nothing yet, of course, of the social hardships of those who were displaced entirely. Yet all these practices of demolition, clearance, and social relocation had been rehearsed and sometimes even celebrated during the preceding experience of war. And equally striking parallels exist between wartime land clearance and the reshaping of post-war suburban terrain, and I'll elaborate a little bit further here. In the Pacific, Seabees cut into mountains of coral and earth, as you can see here, to build flat oil tank pads. They also leveled jungles and coconut tree and sugarcane fields to make way for roadway, airfields, and military base construction. This image from a battalion logbook pits road building Seabees and bulldozers as engaged in a battle against the jungle. During war then, nature became just another enemy to be conquered. And that ideology too would carry over to the post-war home front. Similar practices realized on post-war American orchards and hillsides made room for home front, suburban, and highway development. The transformation of Southern California perhaps epitomizes this most clearly. Orange County was the fastest growing large post-war county in the country, fastest growing by population. Vast clearance underpinned this growth, reducing orange acreage by half during each of the 1950s and 60s. Today, less than 67 acres remain from the nearly 67,000 acre peak in 1945. So here's the before and after suburban image pairing, right? How did we get here? Well, statewide, during the 1960s, bulldozers reportedly felled one orange tree every 55 seconds. Afterwards, contractors burned the refuse on site. Orange County was issuing an average of 500 burning permits per month by the mid-1960s before the practice was banned. The whole process of tree uprooting, refuse removal, and topsoil redistribution cost only about $1 per tree, or roughly $100 an acre, making the destruction of orchards an economical step in the home building process. Now, as the supply of affordable orchard flatlands dwindled, developers turned to the hillsides for additional building sites. Right? They ran out of the easier locations, but this property was available in part because it hadn't made practical or economic sense to build here before. But now, thanks to advances in earth-moving equipment and methods, the increased use of engineers and geologists as consultants on some of these suburban home building projects, and the spread of best practices about how to do this work in manuals published by the National Association of Home Builders, it was no longer the case that these were not logical places to build from a business perspective. As that association declared in 1969, quote, "There is hardly a site that cannot be developed to serve man." So although hillside leveling began with the clearance of trees and shrubs, cut and fill was where the real earth moving occurred and where the bulldozer really came in. A combination of bulldozers and scrapers dug into steep hillsides and moved the excavated material to below grade areas. Earth movers on one typical project in Anaheim Hills, California, moved enough dirt to cover an entire football field more than 2 stories high each day. Right? So just trying to wrap your head around how much material is being moved here. And the contractor on this particular job began this work with a D7 track-mounted bulldozer, which was one of the workhorses of the World War II military. Heavy scrapers transported the excavated material while simultaneously beginning the compaction process. Sheep's foot rollers, which is what this is right here. Here's the scraper carrying the dirt. Here's the sheep's foot roller. Those finished the task of flattening the soil. And finally, bulldozers redistributed topsoil and fast-growing rye to help cohere that soil together. The result was the creation of step terraces that supported the flat building pads necessary for large-scale mass-produced housing. So here's the blank slate in the suburbs writ large. But such intensive intrusions into the landscape obviously came at a cost. Returning to the war for a moment, Seabees on one island experienced 19 landslides in just one day as they excavated earth to build a jungle roadway. More commonly, though, the consequences of their work revealed themselves over time in a process of slow violence, to use the term coined by Rob Nixon. For example, clearance for roads and airfields brought not only immediate destruction, but also often permanently diminished some of the island's most fertile ground. And native populations lost their homes and livelihoods for standing in the Allied bulldozers' way. In Hawaii, for example, the Navy crushed sugarcane and pineapple plants to plow roadways down the hillside. Although they didn't own this property, that posed no practical problem. As one observer noted, quote, "The pineapple people had no choice. Eventually, you must sell at the Navy price." Claiming and clearing property proved even easier in the South Pacific, where native homes were often of simpler construction, and colonial powers could deprive locals of property rights to their land. One battalion logbook includes this image here that you see of a CB demolishing an islander's home. And the caption is important. It labels it "destruction for construction," right? So how do you justify this violent act? It's thinking about what is to come next. And we can see similar parallels in the legacies of post-war domestic construction projects. Aggressive hillside development often yielded erosion and culminated, often decades later, in landslides of their own. And here you can see one such landslide on the slopes of a Southern California suburban home project. Ironically, the bulldozer is one of the machines often called in to clean up the debris that results from a landslide. So actually through its work, it generates more work for itself, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Bulldozers beget bulldozers. But the social trauma of residential displacement has been even more enduring, I think, than some of these landscape effects. This is an image of a home of a Latino American family being bulldozed for urban renewal in Chavez Ravine, California. That site, as you may know, would eventually become part of Dodger Stadium. Across the country, members of racial, ethnic, and sexual minority groups bore the disproportionate burden of clearance-based displacement. On the following clip that I'm going to show is an excerpt from a public hearing that took place in Philadelphia in the early 1960s. It's actually from my current project. Philadelphia is known for deploying historic preservation, rehabilitation, restoration more avidly than most cities did, but it also cleared away still at the same time. And this is a testimony from someone who has been slated to lose her home.
Not much of public speaking, gentlemen. I am Mildred Russello. I am the parent of four daughters and a son. They say a mother's happiness comes from her children when they are toddlers. Well, I never was that fortunate to have that happiness because I went out to work in a meatpacking house, 18 below. I went with that purpose to help my husband, to lift the burden, to help pay off the mortgage at 412. Well, last year, we finally reached that goal. And then our bridges came tumbling down when all this redevelopment came along. To think that I have to uproot my family, and I heard something about relocation. Someone mentioned a project. Well, I think it's unconstitutional. Maybe that's the wrong word. Well, I think that's the right word for how I feel. To have to put my children in a project, which I heard we would have to go. We had to deprive ourselves and my children of many little luxuries because, as you know, down the waterfront, it's very hard work and you work when the ships come in. And I don't think a tourist with any humane feeling would appreciate a garden or would want to park their car if they knew the knowledge that a family had to be uprooted. I'm very nervous. That's all I can say. That's how I feel.
Mrs. Sobel, would you have any objections to remodel your home according to the authority?
I'm looking forward to all this because, Mr. Turner, when we moved in this home, the floors were termiting from the joists. And we had a coal stove for almost 2 years, so we were able to put oil heat in. That was the reason I went to work. And it took all these years to do it. And we finally reached the goal when we paid off the mortgage about 6 months ago.
But you would be willing to conform to the authority?
For it.
You would go back to work for just to live there?
I've been local for 95 for 19 years.
So Mildred Sobel is making the case that the house is not in bad shape, but she's willing to invest more to even upgrade it. But still, the plan is for demolition of the site, and she's unsuccessful. Ultimately, her home is gone. The majority of the displaced residents in Mildred Sobel's neighborhood were ethnic whites, like the Polish-speaking neighbor whose testimony followed hers, if I were able to show you a bit more of this film. These ethnic minority residents of Eastern European descent were not uncommon targets of urban renewal. But nationally, 60% of residents relocated for urban renewal were non-white. Highway clearance functions similarly, and relocation also proved challenging as federal assistance was inconsistently available depending on why and where one was being displaced for urban renewal or a highway and in which state this was happening. In this photo, you can see one relocation agent speaking with residents who would be displaced by urban renewal in Washington, D.C.'s Southwest neighborhood. Across the country, 90% of the housing destroyed was never replaced. Due in part to real estate market segregation, African Americans purchased only 2 to 3% of the new owner-occupied housing units constructed in the suburbs, essentially imposing a double blow. They were more likely to be displaced and less likely to own the new housing that was being built. Relocation also wrought harsh emotional impacts. Follow-up studies found that physically improved housing never made up for the psychosocial losses of communities torn apart. As one displaced resident in New Haven recalled, it was very traumatic for all of us, a way of life went. Now, visual culture from the war and early post-war period positioned the work of the machines and the practitioners of clearance in a positive all-American light that helped facilitate their popular embrace, even as these disastrous outcomes were also coming about. For example, wartime advertisements suggested that exerting the bulldozer's pressure on the earth was akin to bulldozing over the leaders of Axis powers. Wartime journalism even made these allusions more literal, popularizing stories of operators who used their bulldozers to both level the land and battle the enemy. In one notable incident, depicted in this cartoon on the right, a military equipment operator deployed his blade to crush a bunker filled with Japanese snipers. Oft-repeated tales like this one, and you can find this story in newspapers around the country, helped make construction operators and their machines patriotic heroes. Wartime films offered further drama. In the climactic scene of the Fighting Seabees from 1944, Seabee John Wayne valiantly rides his bulldozer into battle. And although Wayne dies in the incident, the bulldozer carries on without him, crushing into an oil tank to create an explosion that sends the attacking Japanese enemy fleeing. So the bulldozer itself kind of saves the day. I want to take a very quick look at a short scene near the film's end, not the one that I just described, which celebrates both construction men and their machines.
Teach him the monument construction, man. Why did you shoot him, Paul? I was afraid the fall might kill him.
All right, so you may not have heard John Wayne. He said that'll teach him to mess with construction men, right? So the machines, the men, all glorified in this film, which is one example, I think, of a larger kind of canon of material that glorifies all of these. Representations such as these help turn the bulldozer operator into an updated version of the American cowboy. And the bulldozer man, as we might call him, was strong, handsome, white, and rode a mighty beast to conquer new frontiers. And this near full page image appeared in Life magazine at the end of the war, perhaps visualizing this best. These associations continued into the post-war period as the bulldozer man moved on to conquer so-called urban slums and as yet undeveloped suburban landscapes. In the process, the labor of the bulldozer operator, deploying powerful American-made technology, offered a patriotic antidote to collective Cold War anxieties over masculinity. As one advertisement enthusiastically predicted near the war's end, Mother Earth is going to have her face lifted. Sounds like a rather ambitious undertaking, doesn't it? But that is more or less what's going to happen after this world struggle is over. The Earth is in for a tremendous resurfacing operation. The construction, road building, and grading jobs for crawler-type tractors in that not-too-distant period are colossal. Now, of course, you'll also note Mother Earth's somewhat forlorn expression as our cowboy plows across her surface, perhaps in prophetic anticipation of the resistance that's still ahead, perhaps. Post-war writing also depicted construction men with childlike admiration. One operator quoted in a 1954 article described the, quote, fun of operating a shovel. Speaking gleefully of the work of his mechanical cats, he boasted, "The big machine gave me a sense of power. I, a man of average size, could walk up to a mountain and move it." And a new genre of children's bulldozer books also helps naturalize clearance by celebrating happy, helpful bulldozer operators and their friendly mechanical mates. You might think here of books like Katie and the Big Snow, I Want to Be a Road Builder in the middle, and one of my favorite titles, The Affable, Amiable Bulldozer Man, who looks very satisfied with himself after toppling that building from 1880, right? If you look and see, good job. Other titles, including Virginia Lee Burton's Mike Mulligan and his Steam Shovel from 1939 and Clement Hurd's Benny the Bulldozer from 1947 adds to this list, and maybe you're thinking of others as well. Books like these normalize construction equipment and processes while making the equipment itself seem less scary. Construction equipment toys took that process even further. Tonka trucks and model toys, which also first appeared in the early post-war years, paired with bulldozer books to help youngsters make sense of the rapidly changing world around them. Yet they did so in a way that positively reflected the interests of the equipment makers and construction contractors who sometimes supported the publication of these books and the production of these toys. And so building upon the strong foundation established by World War II, and then carried over into the post-war period through more powerful technology, plentiful skilled laborers, advanced clearance practices, and positive popular representations, the culture of clearance ran rampant across the landscape. As the pace of destruction reached its peak during the 1960s, its harmful consequences were becoming increasingly clear. The purportedly clean, blank slates that clearance sought to achieve proved anything but simple in practice. In Southern California, boosterish bulldozing for new quote-unquote crops of housing depleted farmland, instigated landslides, and furthered sprawl. At the same time, in New Haven, initially triumphal performances of clearance by Mayor Lee and others gave way to decades of dirty and damaging neighborhood invasion that ruptured communities and often yielded rubble-strewn, vacant lots, turned parking lots at best. And the interstate highway network spreading across the country sliced through cities and natural landscapes, dividing communities in its path. Overall, clearance of the natural and built environment all too often proved physically difficult, socially traumatic, and environmentally damaging. So by the late 1960s and 70s, where I end my story, mounting criticism was developing. Seminal written works by Jane Jacobs and In the Environmental Spirit of Rachel Carson embody this growing critique. But dissent also abounded in other media. For example, the bulldozer became a veritable paintbrush, appearing in new forms of conceptual art, like earthworks and architecture. Artist Michael Heiser appropriately donned a cowboy hat as he transported the machine to the desert to dig massive excavations that essentially stopped time, preserving the cuts and voids for all to see, instead of covering them over, as happens on the construction site. Robert Smithson used a backhoe to pile dirt atop a wooden shed at Kent State, only stopping once the building's roof broke. Walter D. Maria was even more explicit when he painted a 7 by 20 foot canvas in caterpillar yellow paint and affixed a plate in the middle that read, "The color men choose when they attack the earth." Artists like these offered subtle critique, reappropriated heavy equipment and wrecking sites, and even at times advanced social and environmental reclamation. Counter-narratives also increasingly appeared in more popular media. Instead of the children's book Tear Down to Build Up from 1960, we now have this dream sequence in a book called My House is Your House from 1970, in which the protagonist is chased by a bulldozer that will soon wreck her New York City apartment building. In the 1973 film Soylent Green, trucks mounted with bulldozer-like shovels do the work of rounding up people to serve as the ingredients for the film's mysterious foodstuffs. More graphically, in 1974, the comic book The Thing Called Killdozer depicted a possessed and fanged bulldozer about to eat multiple human targets. "That bulldozer, it's alive," laments the male hero, "and it's trying to destroy us." Now, these fictive depictions, while graphic and somewhat humorous, reflected changing attitudes towards the machine as broader social, political, and economic life was changing as well. Riots and arson wrought uncontrolled devastation in American cities, while sprawl spread rapidly outside them. Foreign manufacturers like Komatsu began to usurp American dominance of the construction equipment trade, and construction hard hats lent their support to a very different and more controversial kind of war on people and land in Vietnam. Within this altered context, and in light of experiences gained on post-war clearance sites, Americans in this later time period were more commonly found battling against rather than with the once celebrated machine. Their protests helped to spur legislative changes like the National Historic Preservation Act, 1966, and the National Environmental Protection Act of 1970. Whereas the post-war period had seen the introduction of substantial federal subsidies for highway construction and slum clearance, as well as tax incentives for greenfield development, national policies introduced during the 1960s and 70s supported preservation, environmentalism, and the increased citizen participation in the planning and use of space. Although building demolition and land clearance certainly continue today, their character, pace, and scale have been changed by the processes and consequences revealed on the once welcoming landscapes of their widespread post-war implementation. Ultimately, the reforms those experiences spurred have helped to slow, although of course not to stop, the destructive progress of the American bulldozer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've got some time for questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand. Either myself or Sharon will bring a mic to you so we can all hear. And then we'll try to get some questions from Zoom if there are some there too.
Very interesting topic. And you've made the case for the negative aspects of bulldozing. I'm not an expert in urban renewal at all, but I can't help but think there must be some positive aspects to destruction in cities, particularly after the war, when you had all these men who had all these skills. And, you know, when you have a hammer in your hand, everything looks like a nail. So I'm wondering, can you sort out for us what role population increase had post-war on the need or the use of destruction? Was there something positive about destroying structures that benefited the increasing population? I'm thinking of density in housing and transportation needs with the highways.
Sure. So the population of cities in this period was declining. The ideas behind urban renewal was that people were going to the suburbs, and we have to remake our cities in the kind of suburban image, which is to say, we need to offer more modern structures, and we have to make room for the car. So the buildings, they don't look like suburban buildings transported to the cities, but some of the aspects of them, and to create parking, to create highways, to create modern housing, the bulldozer was the mechanism to get there. So it wasn't so much about that the population was so great in the city that they needed new construction to satisfy it. It was actually going down, and they needed new construction to incentivize people to come back. By and large, a lot of the people who wound up living in urban renewal construction were more moving within the city, or they're people maybe who thought about going to, you didn't actually get a lot of suburbanites coming back in the end. It didn't really succeed, and you could see that in the population counts. They weren't really offering the same thing. There are other factors, schools and lots of other things that fed into that. So that's the one piece about the population. But to your question about, did the bulldozers, was it something useful? Certainly there were facilities that were outdated, and that there's an example in Philadelphia of a wholesale food distribution center that had been located next to the waterfront. It made sense when ships were involved in some of this work, and horse-drawn carts didn't have room for the big trucks that were now going to highways. And so you can argue that this was bad in certain ways for people to lose this facility, but actually they were relocated to a new modern facility at a better location in the city. Part of the problem with the clearance approach was that not everyone got something for their displacement. And so that was kind of a good example, but most of the people who lost their housing didn't get better. They didn't recapture that what they had before. And so it's very much about the process in which these things happened. I think if the relocation and the attention to the rupture of communities and the psychosocial impacts of all of this had been different, that could perhaps have paired better with this clearance approach. Of course, I think that the architecture and the buildings that were there, that was a loss too. And there's something to be said for that. But I really think that process is really important here. And a lot of it doesn't have to do so much with just the buildings. It has to do with social processes and how we work with people in all of this. So I don't want to blame, it's not just the bulldozer at all, but it's the mentality of kind of clearing away and forgetting the things that were there, clearance, and starting with a new blank slate, and which never was, right? There always was something there. But of course, we need new construction, and we need to just manage change in the city. And this is a kind of one end of the spectrum of how it can be done.
This is a fascinating topic, and I want to thank you so much for your presentation. I'm wondering how the bulldozer mentality affects our foreign policy. I'm specifically thinking of all of the resources that we are sending to Ukraine and the resulting destruction of that war, and what's the recovery plan in terms of all that rubble, all the historic structures that have been affected that you might want to save and rebuild, and then so many apartment complexes that have been destroyed. And so have you seen this type of machinery and mentality in a recovery mode? Or is that outside of your research?
I mean, it is outside of what I've looked at, but I do think that we are again at this moment where we're becoming seeing this level of destruction become in cities becomes normal to us again. You know, like we get used to it. It doesn't seem as odd. And I think it could potentially lead to the normalization of destruction in more wider realms. Now, the bulldozer and other machines like it are necessary to clear up things that are destroyed, bombed landscapes and things like that. And then there are questions of what can we rebuild, what can we save? And there are more painstaking ways, of course, of working with what's there too. I haven't actually looked that closely at, I guess it's too soon, in fact, to know for sure what's going to happen with those landscapes. But I'm struck looking at the journalistic coverage, a lot of these things, just how this, again, we're getting used to seeing these scenes, then how does that make people think about what the options are moving forward from this? So I see a repeat in certain ways, but I don't know that it'll continue in exactly that way. But yeah.
My question pertains to eminent domain and what right the government has to come and claim these lands for redevelopment and eminent domain over a period of time. So now there's more awareness about the destruction that comes from these communities and historic preservation and such. So eminent domain in the 60s versus eminent domain now. And just like speak a little bit about that, please, and what the government's process is to come in and claim these lands from private holders.
Sure. Yeah, okay. Sorry, I didn't know where the question was coming from. I was looking around confused. So a seminal urban renewal court case really set eminent domain broadly in motion. Eminent domain has existed, but there was a question of, does this kind of taking qualify? And there was an important case, Berman versus Parker in Washington, D.C., in that Southwest urban renewal project where I showed the relocation taking place. And there was an owner of a commercial property that was fine. It wasn't blighted. It wasn't so dilapidated that it was beyond repair, but it was located in the wrong place. And the owner of that property took the redevelopment authority to court saying, how can you take something that there's nothing wrong with it? And the went to the Supreme Court, and they determined that, you know, the community deserves beauty. I'm forgetting the quote, but that it's in the public interest to create these beautiful, better landscapes. It doesn't matter that you stand in the way. And that opened the floodgates. That had been a question of what could urban renewal do? Do you have to be taking housing for new housing? The original policy, that's what it said. If you're going to be taking someone's home, you have to be building new homes. And then it evolves over time after this Supreme Court case to say, no, you can be building a mall. You can be building something that's really for another private group that's not about housing at all. And that made the program practical. And the eminent domain has lived on and continues to broadly consider what the public good is here. Is it a pharmaceutical company, and the jobs that it will create? So this understanding of eminent domain is really important for making this clearance possible. It's not just about the brute force of the machine. It's very much about what's legally allowed and what is the public good. And in these projects, these are all housing acts. Urban renewal is all Housing Act of 1949, Housing Act of 1954, but it gave us stadiums and shopping malls and housing, luxury housing too. And eminent domain is what legally made that possible.
I have a question from our Zoom audience.
Yes.
And that person would like to ask, based on the examples I can remember, did this urban renewal occur more in the north? How does this practice fit within the Great Migration and the reactionary policies that followed? Redlining, racial covenants, etc.
That's a great question. I've said it's a national program, and indeed it is. If you go to a website by my colleague, Brent Siebel at the University of Pennsylvania, it's called Renewing Inequality. It's based at the University of Richmond, and they map on there all the urban renewal projects in the country, including Puerto Rico. And you can see this, it really is a national phenomenon, but there are different scales of what happened. And I think you're absolutely right that when I gave you that statistic, that 2/3 of those who were displaced for urban renewal were non-white, a lot of this work was associated with places that had become crowded through the Great Migration or through migrations having to do with war efforts too. You know, that population increased in Western cities to staff the war efforts, and then what to do about these locations too. So absolutely, there are direct connections between places that were redlined and that were disinvested, that were you know, largely occupied by non-white populations. They were the ones that were then labeled as dilapidated and blighted and needing to be renewed and cleared. And so we can see greater concentrations in these places in the north. So it's uneven for sure, but it truly was a nationwide policy because this was the solution on offer. If you wanted to improve your city, the Housing Act of 1949 said, we'll give you 2/3 of the cost of acquiring and clearing land if you're going to clear it. If you wanted to do some rehabilitation work, no, we have no money for you. We have it if you were going to implement slum clearance. Over time, they become more embracing of other approaches, which is how Philadelphia is able to use preservation and rehabilitation. But initially, this is the approach. And so if you're going to participate in this modernization of your city, it's going to be grounded in clearance. And a lot of the cities that got most heavily involved in that were doing that in part to address, you know, racial compositions of their neighborhoods and starting with those areas where those groups had less political power to resist what was going to happen. But ultimately, it truly is a national phenomenon.
I'll do it up here. Does your book talk about the fact that sometimes that urban renewal was very necessary? I think out here locally, there are two neighborhoods that come to mind, and that's Sweet Hollow on the east side of St. Paul that my great-grandparents lived in, and the Flats, the Levee area down on the west side. Both of those areas were bulldozered in the 1960s because they didn't have running water, or there were significant floodings and the homes were really dilapidated. And what you said made sense because both areas never got rebuilt as homes. So I'm just curious, does your book ever touch on the fact that sometimes areas need to go because they didn't have running water or services, or they were unsafe or dilapidated?
Mm-hmm. I don't think I get into that as much in the book, but I can comment on this, which is that absolutely. So there were these public health surveys often that underpin some of the selections. You have redlining maps, but also public health surveys, which I'm not doubting when they count, you know, the lack of electricity, of indoor plumbing, of running water, all these things, and the conditions of the buildings. It's not, there's some subjectivity to some of that, but are these services present or not? It's true that a lot of these areas did need investment. Was clearance the only way forward is the question. And then secondly, was clearance and displacement the only way forward? Could we have repaired some of the buildings? And if not, could we have built something new there that would be for the population that was living there as well? And of course, public housing is something that goes up on cleared sites too. It's just that the pace of public housing construction doesn't match the pace of the clearance that's occurring. So you have people displaced without enough places for them to go. And also the quality of what's built oftentimes for the public housing doesn't match the quality of what's being built in these urban renewal areas. So there's some interesting studies. I did some research on the Southwest Project in DC and on other places by sociologists. Well, I should say, tried to track where did people go? What happened to people? And these relocation divisions did their best to try to find people better housing. And when they did, they often found them physically better housing. They did address that physical need. Now, a lot of people didn't trust them. They would go on their own, or they had a family that was too large, or too large for the public housing that was available, or the new housing that was offered to them was not remotely convenient to their job or their family or their church. So there are all those issues, but they really focused on those material issues. And I think a lot of that was correct. The question, though, was how do you solve those material issues? There were physical deficits, but what's the solution? And was clearance the only way forward, I think, is the question.
You know, you mentioned Philadelphia, but other examples within the United States that say urban renewal more appropriately or less negative effect. And have you contrasted what we did in the U.S. versus, say, Europe? Are there examples there where they have a lot more historical attributes, but they also had gone through, you know, building roads and so on in cities. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, lots of cities have the areas that they cleared as well, but I think there's sometimes, you know, the areas in Europe, these are older, and what was perceived as worth preserving in the U.S. was a smaller amount. So even in Philadelphia, where rehabilitation and preservation were a greater part of the plan, what they thought was worth preserving was anything basically from the colonial era only. You know, so it's still like, it has to be old enough for people to start thinking of it as historic and something that we want to conserve. And so a lot of what was torn down wasn't from that period, but of course other places have tackled this differently, and also places have cleared and built new housing too in different ways than the US. When they built public housing, I'm thinking especially of Germany, for example, it's a totally different system. It's modern. It's not just for the poor too, and it's built to a higher standard. And there are just different ways of actually pairing clearance with new construction that doesn't kind of deal so many blows to the victims of this process too. So it's a much bigger question about how we think about housing, and in this country where we really privilege home ownership and individual homes over apartments and things like that too. So there's a much bigger context here, but absolutely there are other international examples. And then within the US, there are certain cities who have done it more than others too. But interestingly, scholars who have looked at when cities started to embrace more preservation and rehabilitation versus clearance, it wasn't because they suddenly became preservationists. It was often because it was faster and cheaper. They realized it was so hard actually to clear all this land, relocate all the people, and attract developers to build new projects. They turned to rehabilitation and preservation because actually they could get the job done more quickly. So there was a lot of learning by doing in the process here. And that is part of why the federal government, 5 years after the Housing Act of 1949, says, oh yeah, we'll give them money also for rehabilitation, not just for clearance, because we got to get this going actually.
Good morning, Michael Gilson. I actually am a business representative for the operators union here. Couple quick questions. Yeah. One is how many equipment operators we might have in the crowd here today? Because I've built my life off of running Bulldozer for my 6 kids. 2, I'm also wondering how you feel, or if you've looked at the cause and effect of, say, riots and letting cities burn in specific areas and housing burn, like you said, bulldozing the slums to rebuild, kind of what that takes place also.
Yeah, so when we think about the burning of the Bronx, for example, and the way a lot of these processes of the destruction of cities gets a bit more out of control, I think, you know, the visual of Dick Lee on his, you know, on the machine, controlling the wrecking of the building, it's a very different idea that we can actually kind of surgically go in, fix this area by knocking down these buildings and draw a little line around this area, and then over time, we start to see that we can't control these processes. And so as the destruction of cities kind of gets taken into its own hands and these later moments in time, people start to look with a little less favor at tearing things down so quickly, or just, you know, letting also the disinvestment of post-industrial cities where the buildings are just kind of sitting there rotting too. So people start to get a little bit more concerned about these things as well. But there was a real optimism in the 50s, in the 60s, that there was this expertise that there's just, you know, we can map where the problems are. And if we can just literally cut that out and reinsert in something else and move away the problem, that's going to solve it. And I think our understanding of the sophistication of how neighborhood dynamics work have changed this, but also the associations with those moments of disinvestment in cities and arson and riots and all those things have changed our associations with the tearing down of cities too. So lots of different things going on. Again, it's coming out of the war where we're going to uplift cities by removing the rubble. We're going to do that same thing in the post-war period. We get further away from that, and the associations with this violent attack on cities start to be a little bit different, I think.
For the sake of time, there may be more questions, but Francesca will be available after. I do have one more question I want to ask. Has the pendulum swung too far in the other direction when we have most cities in the US having housing shortages, severe housing shortages, and the price of housing going up, and a very, for good reason, a resistance to change because of the changes that did happen post-war and the destruction it did wrought and the real trouble that it caused in terms of for a lot of populations. Have we gone too far where we've made it too difficult to build housing, too difficult to change our cities to meet the needs that they need today?
It's a good question. So it goes back to the population point from before when cities were responding to a very different situation. I think people can use kind of historical arguments, marshal them for just resistance to change in general. But I am in favor of a slower process. I think that's a good thing. I think it allows different stakeholders to weigh in and figure out where development should occur, and that it's going to integrate hopefully lots of different classes and integrate transportation and housing in that's totally different from what we're doing during urban renewal. We weren't thinking about public transit with how we're developing things at all. These were separated. We weren't integrating uses during urban renewal. It was very much about the housings here, the industries here, the commercials here. Now mixed use is what we're doing. And it wasn't about integrating classes of people. And so a lot of new developments that are being proposed to address housing shortages are offering market rate housing, but also affordable housing mixed in. So it's actually the composition of the projects now that are different that is important. And I think we should debate them. And I think that we should build some housing too, that to come, if it's a total way of just grinding the gears and building nothing, then that is swung too far. But I think without as much oversight and without the protections that did come along for historic preservation and environmental protection, the outcome is what we got. And so we need those protections in place. And hopefully we still continue to build. And maybe we use some old structures as part of that too and integrate with them. But the process of city building right now, the philosophy of it, even when I talk to my students about urban renewal and say, oh, they wanted to remove all the stores, they wanted just housing. And they said, what? Who wanted to live in that kind of neighborhood? We want different things now too. So it's a different moment. I'm optimistic, but I'm optimistic for my students too. And that gives me a lot of great hope about how we're doing things differently too.
Well, thank you so much. Give another round of applause for our speaker today.
Thank you.